So theoretically, I could just watch it on Instagram and not keep in class.
You could, technically, yeah. You could. What is this?
Do you post this on YouTube too, or do you just
Yeah. Yeah, do it all. I'll let you know if this works, by the way. If it's
There's
like,
this teacher that teaches math class on like one of those,
yeah,
and he makes so much money.
like he teaches.
He teaches his class, but he films it, and the clicks like we were talking about. Everyone that watches it, he makes a lot of money off of it.
Okay.
But everyone has to take math.
Yeah,
And everyone struggles with it. And it
I
gets to
take
a teacher that
yeah, he's a really good teacher. Like
You don't have
that's
to
the
math?
only way I got through.
Oh, I
was,
like
watching
reason I
his
changed my
classes.
major was because I didn't want to take 5 math classes.
Oh.
My teacher's supposed to change.
All right, let's talk about the scapegoat because I want to make sure that everybody kind of understands the rhetorical understanding of the scapegoat as opposed to the religious one. I don't know if I agree 100% with Steve Bartman as a scapegoat, but let's just kind of break down our understanding of it within the realm of rhetoric. And so the first part of it, or the first kind of interesting element, or important element, was that, Kenneth Burke, there we go, is really the rhetorician, the rhetorical scholar who theorized, really fleshed out that theory of the scapegoat and how it gets used within a society or within a group of people to bring people together. Remember, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, that Burke made the argument that language by nature is divisive. It automatically splits us apart because by saying that I'm me and Zach's Zach, that means that we cannot be one person or one entity in the whole, right? Using those words separate us. So Burke makes the argument that rhetoric, the kind of central goal, central function of rhetoric is to bring people back together. Often in very kind of tenuous, not necessarily realistic social, cultural ways, right? So, let's say that Guy and I, we're going to try to make ourselves very similar because we like baseball, whereas every other part of our life we have nothing in common. But that may one day get us in a fight with somebody else, and we'll, team up, right? And three ninjas that shit, right? Okay, we'll take them down. But the point is that identification is rhetorical. That linkage is rhetorical. It's based only in language. So for Burke, right, the scapegoat is one of those tools that we use to kind of work through trauma or disorder. There were two other ways there. Do you remember we talked about this on day one? We know. Mortification and transcendence. All right, so these are the two other ways that in a moment that a group suffers from trauma or when order is disrupted, we look to these rhetorical tools, to these language-based tools in order to reestablish the hierarchy, to reestablish order. I think I brought up in class, did we talk about like 9/11 on our first day? We never talked about that? No. Okay. So again, these rhetorical tools are based in a culture. They're a cultural tool. And culture can be small. It can be this classroom. It can be this school. It can be a country. When we get into talking about myth today, it can be an entire population, right? The human population will lean on kind of myth and the rhetorical elements of myth, the storytelling and narratives about that. But when a culture goes through trauma, the culture will tend to lean on an established set of tools to reestablish order. And here in the United States, after 9/11, these three things, it's a good example of how these three things had been deployed. And so, mortification. You might have some talking heads discussing the way that the U.S. and the imperialization of the world, right, the taking over the world by the U.S., by U.S.-based technology systems, actually made it possible for Al-Qaeda to set up this attack on the U.S., right? It's almost like saying, okay, it's easy for the world to hate us. Look how we live. We should take some of that blame. And so I guess, if we went back in history and we tried to uncover some of the discourse in the media, people who were talking at that time, we could probably pinpoint examples of certain commentators who were saying this kind of thing. after the financial meltdown in 2008, we had a similar thing where, there were a few months, I think probably 12, 14 months after that fall meltdown that, the markets collapsed and everything, where Americans just didn't spend money. We didn't go anywhere and buy stuff. And we can look at that and say that's mortification. Because what mortification is, it's just taking on the responsibility yourself. You're blaming yourself for the trauma, for the disorder. Okay? That's what mortification is for Burke. Again, you're blaming yourself. You're taking responsibility for that disorder, that trauma. So this guy, Barry Brumman, we talked about Brumman, I think, a little bit on day one. He's a rhetorical scholar that uses a lot of Burke. And one of his big papers, he looks at the presidential rhetoric from the 1990 campaign. And his argument is that this guy, I'm trying to think who it was, John Anderson, who's a third-party candidate, I think he came up with the DeLorean. I think he invented the DeLorean. If you want to look that up to confirm or deny. He used mortification, and it was kind of defining characteristics of his campaign, where it was like, okay, the reason why the U.S. is going through all of this kind of negative economic downturn is because we're just spending too much, right? We're buying everything on credit, we're being greedy, all of this, and we need to kind of tighten up our belts and stop spending so much money. Like that was the crux of his campaign rhetoric, as opposed to Trump's being like, make America great again, America's the greatest thing ever. That's not what Anderson was going for. Anderson was going for, no, right, we need to spend less. We need to be more frugal and all of this. Interestingly enough, Brumman has in recent years kind of said that was the last time you saw presidential candidates tell the American people they couldn't spend money. And ever since, we have presidents who actually say that we need to spend ourselves out of recession. And that's kind of what Bush did. If you think about in 2001, after, none of you are probably old enough to remember this, aside from a few of us, after 2001, Bush made this speech about going back and being Americans again, right? And spending and consuming and doing this. Like, this is how we're going to get out of the trauma and the turmoil, right? It's going to be transcendence, all right? That's the other thing. We're going to move past it. We're not going to treat the problem. We're going to pretend the problem doesn't exist. And so to kind of walk back to mortification for a second, that doesn't work anymore because you can't tell people not to spend money. You can't tell Americans not to spend money. It doesn't work, right? It's almost like it's in our genetic material. It's not, right? Obviously not. But, we believe it. So instead, we tend to go towards the scapegoat or transcendence. But we'll talk about transcendence here for a second. Okay. So the transcendence is we move past the problem and pretend nothing happened, right? You go home for the weekend, you get in a massive fight with your parents. You never solve anything, but you go back to Christmas and you pretend that nothing happened, right? Which is what a lot of us have to do, right? Family, right? Family tends to be that place where transcendence happens. We never solve the problem. We never go after the problem. Instead, we often treat the problem, the trauma, the disorder as a natural component of that system, of that cultural system, of that sphere of information, culture, discourse, what have you. So what I mean by that is, if we consider capitalism or neoliberalism, American market economics as a self-contained discourse, as a system that we understand. We understand what economics is. We understand what capitalism is. We can point to it. And so when a financial meltdown happens like in 2008 and shit hits the fan, nobody is going, oh, that's capitalism's fault, right? Nobody's saying, oh, this happened in the 1980s, this happened in the 1930s. This is like capitalism has an issue with it. It's got a problem and it needs to be fixed. But instead, you see politicians like Mitt Romney saying, this is a natural cycle. This is a natural cycle. This is what happens in a capitalistic society or in capitalism, right? That economic system. Every 15, 20 years, we have a bubble, that bubble bursts, and things correct themselves. Now, what that means is, right, the transcendence, it allows us to not actually consider the fact that people are negatively affected by the problem, by the disorder. And so, 9/11, we can transcend past it, say America's going to be great again, right? We're going to do these things without ever acknowledging the fact that there are problems with U.S. foreign relations, or there should be a conversation had between the West and the Middle East, because instead we just kind of move past it. Yeah, are you excited? Is there a goal? Who Tunisia?
England.
We beat them. We beat them.
It was just
Yeah,
a goal.
1776. Yeah, but again. Okay. So how much time? What's the time?
They got 4 extra seconds on the clock. It's at 90.
Oh no, they just scored? Wow, that's intense. Sorry, Tunisia. First the Arab Spring and now the World Cup 2018. Wow. Okay. All right, so before we jump into scapegoating, do we understand these two, mortification, transcendence? Do you understand? We're good? Mortification is the individual taking on the responsibility themselves. You're embodying it a little bit. And again, I think that's the best example is the lack of confidence in the marketplace after the financial meltdown. When it's like there's data to prove it, right? The University of Michigan's confidence index, it was like the lowest reading it's had in its history. People just didn't feel comfortable spending money, buying things for themselves in a lot of ways. That's mortification. You're taking on the guilt. Or even, it probably continues now, right? We don't buy houses, we don't go and get a bunch of mortgages. I don't know, maybe that's not still mortification, it's something else. But again, I think that's those 18 months after the meltdown, that's a good example of that. Then transcendence is just moving past the problem, the disorder, the issue, and pretending that it didn't happen, okay? The meltdown, what else? Steroids in baseball, right? I think if we want to think of, or that's not even a good example. That's not the best example. CTE. The NFL is doing that with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Failing to acknowledge or discuss the fact that it exists, and instead just putting together pockets of money, pools of money to pay off players that have it, without ever necessarily looking at the problem itself and trying to counteract it, trying to do something, or even having a conversation about the dangers of football. That's not a conversation that's had. Instead, we just move past it and never actually discuss the issue with it. So those are the kind of first two. The one that the movie talks a lot about, and the one that the one that's prime for picking is the scapegoat. Okay, so let's see, the vessel of our guilt. I believe this is the correct Burke quote. Right. Okay, hold on. There we go. Okay. Am I still live streaming? Probably not. Okay. Okay, so Burke says, the scapegoat is this person, this entity, okay, who in a society, in a culture, is going to be the stand-in for the guilt, the negative feelings that is being experienced by everybody else in that group, okay? That's what's key. Hold on 1 second. Okay. Yeah. Okay. What are you saying?
The Columbia.
Oh, the Columbia National Team.
Columbia plays tomorrow.
All right, sorry. So vessel of our guilt. So that's what's key. Okay, let me walk this back a little bit. So the scapegoat is first and foremost somebody who is like us. All right, so somebody from our group, from our culture, from our community, whom we can identify with. There is a level of identification with the scapegoat. We must see ourselves in that person. Because in order for that person to be an effective vessel of the bad things we don't like about ourselves, we have to be able to identify with them. We have to see ourselves in that person. So the argument is, right, this is why it comes up in religion, who would be the kind of ideal scapegoat in Christianity? Jesus, right? Pre-coming out of a cave, Jesus. The person who is a human being, right? Who is flawed in the sense that he believes so devoutly in this idea, right? And who he is as a person, and he's willing to die for it. That person, right, is a scapegoat. We need to be able to see ourselves in that person. Ironically enough, right? If we probably go through and do some sort of rhetorical analysis of biblical rhetoric. There is the scapegoat, there is identification with Jesus. Once he becomes Christ, you can't identify with that person, right? That person's a God, right? Or an angel, whatever you want to call it, right? Christ, right? Christos. So there's a big shift right there, right? That moving the rock away. Happy Easter, everybody.
Kanye might be able to.
Okay, what'd you say?
I said Kanye might be able to.
Kanye, Jesus, you're right. We could, he could explain it. So the scapegoat, okay, that person, we have to be able to see ourselves in that person, and that person must be able to sufficiently serve as this container for all of the negative things we don't like about ourselves. And then that person has to be destroyed. Okay, that's the key here. That person has to be somehow eliminated from public consciousness, or I don't want to say public consciousness, but no longer be a kind of actor within that culture. And so that's why I think Steve Bartman probably works that way. Now, what is it about Bartman that Cubs fans or fans in general would see themselves in?
Wait, do that again.
What is there?
Wait, didn't catch up.
What is it about Bartman or who Bartman is that Cubs fans could see themselves can relate with?
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Get the ball.
Getting the ball?
Getting the ball.
Yeah.
Getting
No,
the
we're not trying to
ball.
go.
Lifelong Cubs.
Lifelong Cubs.
There's 45,000.
Okay.
Wearing turtlenecks.
Wearing turtlenecks. Yeah, that's a good one. But that's key here, right? Is actually knowing, like, you have to have been that person who would go for a foul ball in a game in order to want to blame Steve Bartman, get angry at Steve Bartman. If you never watched baseball, right? Or you've never been to a baseball game or known somebody who'd been to a game or seen a game live where somebody reached for a ball or had no idea of what that experience meant, what that activity meant, then you would have no reason to blame Steve Bartman for anything. There would be no scapegoating. You obviously wouldn't be a fan of anything either, right? If you did that. But Steve Bartman, because he is that mistaken clown, that buffoon, if you will, we can identify with him and that mistake that he made because we've been in that position. So I would make the argument, I don't know what Cubs fans in particular can identify with. That's what I don't get. Like, he's a scapegoat. That's why I don't know if that works, right? Her criticism of the woman of the cloth, her criticism of Bartman, I'm not sure if it works because to me, like, that's just a baseball fan mistake.
I think
right?
look at it and if he wasn't this nerdy, quiet, simple guy and one of those more outlandish Cubs fans who were throwing the beer on him, and maybe somebody who could laugh it off instead of just kind of sit there and go, I think it's just that's the level of that's the only reason why he was the scapegoat. I think if he was loud, if he was bombastic, then people wouldn't. I think people would have been able to accept it a little bit better, or at least would have been angry. Fights would have happened. He would have been arrested. It's just like because of how quiet he was.
I feel like Cubs fans are they like not more reserved anyways? I don't know.
They're
but they're not like on the. They're not on the.
That's why nobody likes.
Oh, they're pretty awful. They pour beer on it.
Nobody likes Cubs fans.
The bleacher bums are pretty bad. Okay, so I mean, I guess there are characteristics of Bartman then that make sense as a scapegoat. There's just the fan. If you take it to the next level of being a fan, right? What fan wouldn't like? I'm sure we can see ourselves being putting ourselves in situations in which we disrupt a game, right? It would be. It's not a hard thing to consider, right? If I was on the first row of seats, I could see myself screwing something up, right? Or, I don't know, tripping. Yeah, I'll stop there. I got to think through it. What were you going to say, Stephanie?
Okay, so I was thinking back to what you were talking about with the, why does it make the Cubs fans specific to him? I was just thinking, well, the Cubs fans are the ones that are most upset about it, so that's why they're their scapegoat. So he identifies with all fans.
Yeah.
But he's the Cubs scapegoat.
He's a kid, so it has that added level of effectiveness for sure. I guess I just wondered, like, he's the dork too.
Yeah.
And that plays, and that's we could all see ourselves in the dork a little bit. So maybe the scapegoat doesn't work for every fan, But for a lot of people, right, the Cubs fan who is paying thousands of dollars to go to this game, because you love that team so much, is kind of dorky, right? Maybe that's the thing about the fan. The fan is kind of a loser no matter what. All of us are losers if we're fans, right? If you think about it, the emotional energy, the care, the love that we put into a team for which we have no influence over is pretty wild. You know, we can't really do anything. That's kind of dorky. Maybe that's part of it. Do you think that prick who threw the beer on him could have been a scapegoat?
That's what I mean.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think that a fan, any of the other fans, that's what just made him the perfect catalyst for being the scapegoat, of just being the nerdy, quiet Cubs fan, basically the only nerdy, quiet Cubs fan that anyone ever sees. And then the guy with the beer, it's probably already shit-faced. If he accidentally interferes, he just gets gets escorted out while people are still throwing beer on him. He's flipping everybody off and still having a good time.
Yeah.
Maybe not a good time, but
I just wonder how well. I don't know. I don't see Bartman as the ideal scapegoat to me.
I think he's more relatable than like if the guy that was throwing the beer were to be the one to have done it. Like I can't relate to that because like even if I were drunk, like I still wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But like
I don't even agree that it was a mistake. I mean, you know, if you've been to enough games, I don't care where you're, if there's a foul ball near you, you're going for it. Now, how did he know that he's probably watching the ball, he doesn't know where Lou is.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just like Bill Buckner said, you know, he's not a player, he's a fan. And, you know, how do you make him the scapegoat when he's doing what like you said, all of us do?
What if it was like a kid or a couple?
Yeah.
see, there you go. Too, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think, like to me, Bill Buckner's a better scapegoat because if we could, we can abstract a lot from that and just say that's a person doing their job who fucked up at their job, and we've all fucked up at our jobs, right? Like, obviously, a world title wasn't on the line or like that, but again, it's a sport. It's not real life per se for us. But like the significance of it, right? There are other things in life that are way more important than being a fan of the Boston Red Sox, okay? But like that, to me, like that sticks. That makes sense. That's a reason, I don't know, I mean, people remember the Buckner story. Do you remember? I mean, to me, that resonates more than the Bartman thing. It's the Buckner thing. I can still, you know, I wasn't, you know, watching baseball at that time, but that seems to resonate more as a sports fan.
Well, I think too because it's a player, and like you were saying,
Yeah.
because it's a pro, it's somebody who should be making that play, especially if it's a clinching World Series.
Yeah.
Who's the Bills kicker that missed the field goals at the same time?
Norwood, what was his name?
Yeah,
Scott Norwood, yeah.
It's the same thing for that guy. But
Yeah.
he's a professional.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
just like Carroll from Seattle,
Mhm.
he called that horrible play. in the
Yeah,
Super Bowl.
yeah.
Still be-
Run the dang
yeah,
ball.
They want him out of there.
Yeah.
That's wild.
do you think you can't see him as a scapegoat because there was like multiple people with their arms out? Like, do you think that's why you're I mean, like, that's why I think, like, he was the main one, but I think, like, why are these other people not being blamed? Because even the players said, like, there was 5 or 6 hands, like, out there, but we're only focused on this one person.
Maybe had he not sat down, he just
Yeah.
kept standing up with everybody.
Yeah.
Kind of blended in.
Because, like, he did say, like, yeah, he looked back and, like, looked at him, but also, like, there's, like, 17,000 people just in that area.
Yeah.
So, like, how do you know who's looking?
I just feel like, I don't know, there has to be a better rhetorical term for what he is. I don't know if it's like the clown or, yeah, I don't know. But I guess before we move on to myth, I wanted to say that it's important that we understand that we have to identify with the scapegoat because oftentimes we are told stories in which there's a monstrous figure presented and that monstrous figure is treated really poorly, but can we identify with that figure? And if we can't, then that's not really a scapegoat. I mean, and it's usually they're rather clear monstrous figures. So like, I would argue that Frankenstein isn't necessarily a monstrous figure. I think there's enough humanity in Frankenstein, the character, for us to identify with Frankenstein, and maybe, you know, you can make the argument that Frankenstein is a scapegoat. But
He's a scientist or the monster?
the a monster. Yeah. The movie, not the book. I think the book is pretty clear. Yeah.
I just think that the monster's name isn't Frankenstein.
Oh yeah, it's just Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
Right? Was that it?
Yeah.
Thanks, Zach.
That's a misconception.
Okay. No, it's good to know. Good to know. So not Dr. Frankenstein. But like think about the Penn State sex scandal, right? I think I asked you this. You can't, like, the scapegoat can't be Jerry Sandusky because he did things that we can't fathom. Joe Paterno can, right? He can be the scapegoat. He can be that person and we say he's just a, egotistical, narcissistic, but kind, right? Old man. I don't know. All right, I want to talk about, do you have any more questions about that? We're good? I want to talk about myth, okay? Is that cool? All right. Let's see what my significant other wanted. Hold on. My kid started coding camp today.
What kind of camp?
Coding.
Coding?
Coding,
How
yeah.
old is she?
She is 5, so they're doing it down south in Texas. They're doing a coding camp. So
Is it like Pearl, like just basics or?
I think so. Yeah,
Really?
I know.
That's awesome.
You were like, why not?
Why
She's
not?
5 years old and she's like,
Yeah, it's when you gotta start your kids now, man. Coders run the world, you know.
Is she learning JavaScript?
No, they start from the basics. Yeah.
Frankenstein's not a signed name, but in the book somewhere he says I ought to be thy Adam, referring to like the first.
Oh, thank you. Who wrote that? Mary Shelley?
Something like that.
Right? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein?
Yep.
Okay, nailed it. All right, let's talk about myth, because myth is fun. Myth. Is the game over? Is the match over?
It's over.
England won, huh?
2-1.
Jeez.
Mexico won.
First they get Meghan Markle, and now they get the Tunisians.
You gotta make her go down.
I care about
The
I did do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I heard about that. There's a little bit notice when Turk's president.
So, sports,
We're
myth.
supposed to lose.
Sports, and
Did you hear Mexico won? I guess I did.
a couple operative terms for us to discuss would be myth, myth, ritual, and the hero. Obviously, it's a very gendered term. Heroine. Is that right?
Really? Hero's a guy? I never knew that.
What?
No, never knew that.
Yeah. Come on. Yeah. Well, learning. I'm glad to teach you something today. Okay. So myth. Shared stories that provide a moral foundation for a community's identity. Shared stories that provide a moral foundation for a community's identity. The operative terms there, obviously, shared, moral, and identity, right? Or community's identity. So there's something in a myth that basically tells us what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, what is ethical, what is unethical, just, unjust, yada, yada, yada. But these stories have to be shared, right? They have to be understood and passed on and basically shared, obviously, between people. And through that sharing and through that information that's passed on, you form a community, you form an identity. This would be rhetorical because, again, rhetoric is a tool for forging identification, for bringing people together. So if we have the same idea of what is right and wrong, what things are good and what things are bad, then we begin to kind of form similarities, identities, shared opinions, beliefs, etc. We have a community, we have a culture. Now, myth, okay. Let's see, other important thing. Second, ritual. The means through which myths are enacted, performed, and ultimately legitimized. Ritual. The means through which myths are enacted, performed, and ultimately legitimized. They're given value. So retelling the myth, actually sitting around and telling stories, would be a ritual. So we think about Greek mythology, right? The passing down of these myths from one generation to the next. The actual act of storytelling is in itself a ritual. Yeah, for sure. The definition?
Yes.
The means through which myths are enacted, performed, and legitimized. Right, so the ways, basically, that myths are given power and value in that community who is using myth to form identification.
Performed and
Legitimized, right? Given credence, given value to it, okay? So think about outside of sports, what rituals do we circulate, practice at Metro State as students that give value to your experience? What do you think?
the trivial
Just showing up?
the brewery.
Let's
Let's do rap.
Let's get rowdy.
Is that what they say?
Something like that. Right? But I mean, the ritual of coming to class and introducing yourself.
I guess like thinking about like how the origin of the road.
Okay, the Roadrunner for sure. But I guess what I'm trying to get at here is there are so many rituals with higher education that aren't necessarily grounded in anything other than myth, ritualization, right? The idea of now we're beginning to see like the ritual of coming to class and sitting in class is beginning to be delegitimized as we transfer our education online. That's a ritual. Once the technology changes how we consume the information, that ritual goes away, right? So the myth, right? The mythos, literally this kind of, not fictitious, but more powerful, more influential than reality, right? Nostalgic, fake, if you will. Sublime would be the best rhetorical term, right? Above the norm, above the actual experience. Think about going to college, right? Being a part of the college environment, all of these things. That begins to go away when we study online, right? That thing, the mythos of higher education, right? Slowly begins to fade as these rituals change. So as you can begin to see here, these rituals give value to the myth. They give value to the mythos, to the mystique, right? They give mystique, all of these things, right? Tied to their Greek and Latin roots, if you will. Okay, does that make sense for you?
Yeah.
Sports fans.
No, I was just thinking more so like fan. Like,
Okay, let's think about ritualized fandom in Denver. What would be some rituals that Rockies fans practice?
They throw peanuts from, I don't know if they're all, when they sing during the seventh inning stretch.
Uh-huh. That is in itself a ritual.
Right, they throw peanuts down to like anybody sitting right behind the home plate.
They do.
I don't know if they do that everywhere else, but
I don't know.
I just watched the game yesterday and they sing America the Beautiful
Okay.
at
All
the
right.
Rangers Stadium instead of singing
God
Take Me
bless.
Out.
Oh,
Or
yeah.
God Bless America instead of singing Take Me Out to the
Do they not sing God Bless America anymore?
They don't sing it. They play like they play the music and then they have the words on the.
Oh, okay. That used to be a thing not that long ago where you sang it. I want to say like 5-6 years ago, you still did it at Coors. So,
Sometimes do it. Playoff games.
yeah. Okay.
What if you make a ritual like at the Rocky Stadium?
Hold on.
When it's American Beautiful, when it sings like to the mountains, it gets like super loud when it's to the mountains, and then like super quiet for the rest.
Yes. So when you're doing that, right, when the act of singing God Bless America or whatever, America the Beautiful, and you scream mountains, that functions to add value to the myth or the mystique of going to Coors Field and being a Rockies fan. The fact that you know I'm supposed to get really loud at the word mountains gives you a sense of value, right, and pride and all of these things that then make you feel connected to that community. You're identifying. That is rhetorical. I'm a Stars fan, Dallas Stars. You go to the game, and every time, right, you hear the national anthem, you hear the Stars, Stars twice. Everybody yells, Stars. I went back for a game for the first time in like 7 years in November, and I remember that. And I felt cool, right? I had goosebumps. I was like, oh, I remember that. I got to do that, okay? So that ritualization has a rhetorical effect because it makes people feel as if they are together, even when they may have nothing else in common. Okay. Now, this becomes problematic when we throw in things like politics in it and God Bless America. Now this is a ritual. This is why, right, I think Wendy on day one said, I hate sports have politics in them. And I said, no, right, politics has been in sports for a long, long time. That has an effect. That seeing God Bless America at Coors not only makes you feel as if you are a Rockies fan, but now you are an American citizen, right? Or you're an American. Okay. Making sure you're awake here. That is in itself political, because then when somebody comes in and they want to leverage God Bless America or standing for the anthem for political purposes, where do you stand when you've been singing God Bless America or standing for the anthem your entire life, even though you may not agree with the president whose politics being thrown at you, right? There becomes an issue with identification. The rhetoric becomes obvious, right? We can begin to problematize the rhetoric. It becomes clear. It's on the surface. It's obvious how fictitious or fake or tenuous it is, okay? But it's always there in that ritual. And so we got to think about these things. We have to think about these things and the importance of it. Tailgating, right? That's a ritual. College football fans in particular, you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, you make breakfast and you get drunk because that's normal, right? Like that's the thing. Outside of that ritual, right? Rituals normalize acts. They normalize behavior in those pockets, in those moments. If you were to do that on a Tuesday morning, all waiting for class, exactly. Calling up somebody, we're going to see if we can't get you in that 12-step program. Okay, so this is the problem with rituals, right? I think the book kind of gets into it. Let's go to the next step here, all right? And then we can talk more about myth and ritual and all this stuff. The hero is the characters in the myth. Okay, the heroine, the hero, the character, usually the embodiment of that morality, of the good, the bad, that we really kind of seek to pull from, to milk out of the myth itself. Right? That is the hero. What's interesting is the more that we tell these myths, the more that the rituals play out, the more impossible it kind of becomes to question the hero, right? You have to, when we're in it, right? When we're a fan, when we're a part of that ritualization, we're part of that process, it becomes hard for us to critique the story, to see how the story is actually working rhetorical to form these bonds. I think a great example of that would be, like, Michael Jordan, for some reason, right? How many years later, 20 years later, we have ritualized, mythologized Michael Jordan. I hated Michael Jordan, right? In the mid-90s. I didn't like Jordan. I liked Reggie Miller. I liked the Pacers. I rooted for the Pacers. I hated Jordan. But now, right, it's like, oh, Jordan's the greatest thing since sliced bread. That is what happens through ritualization and the retelling of myth. Now, these heroes become almost untouchable. They become untouchable. That's also where nostalgia comes in. Okay, we keep retelling these stories, and the retelling is actually skewed off, right? A few degrees separate from the reality, the thing that actually happened, the event itself. And so it's like I was watching what's the 30 for 30 on Reggie Miller. Did anybody see that? Yeah, he scored 9 points in 8 seconds. It was great, right? It's great. But that retelling of it, I mean, it was great, but they dramatize it. And so it becomes, you have an entire 60-minute or 44-minute movie on 8 seconds, right? Like that is ritualization. That is the retelling of a myth. That is nostalgia. Or, Jordan's flu game. That kept coming up.
Did you say Bo
I didn't
Jackson?
even see that.
That would be like a real life myth? Like somebody who doesn't skew very far away from the actual myth.
Yeah. Bo Jackson. What makes Bo so primed for the myth, for the hero? Do you think?
I think
That's good, yeah.
that everyone knew they didn't practice.
Yeah.
He would just show up.
Yeah.
Kind of. I think that's the mythical.
There's also never that fall from grace with Bo, right? I think there's some about those athletes who end on the top that never have that decline. that almost reestablishes or reaffirms the mythical element or mythical characteristics of who they are. You know, I think there's something to be said, certainly, about that. This is going to sound ridiculous, but in figure skating, remember Tara Lipinski? Right? She won gold. She beat Nancy Kerrigan. I can't remember which Olympics. She kind of has, even now, right? She has milked a career off that mythical kind of persona that she has because she came out of nowhere, won one Olympic gold medal, and didn't really do anything the rest of her career, but it also didn't fall off. She just kind of stopped competing.
She's the one that beat up the other one.
No, that's Tanya Hart. Yeah. No, Tara Lipinski does analysis now for, yeah. No, you're thinking of Michelle Kwan.
Oh,
Michelle Kwan, yeah. No, Tara Lipinski was like, came out of nowhere, beat Nancy Kerrigan, took down the favorite, and then never really, she just kind of faded away. She didn't want to do it. You know, it was kind of interesting how that works. I'm trying to think of, you know, Serena, we keep waiting for her to fall. Yeah. I just don't want her to fall now. Like, I don't want to see the fall of Serena at the moment. Did Steffi Graf, was she still at the top of her game when she retired? Andre Agassi wasn't. That sucked, right? Seeing Agassi kind of fall apart. Pete Sampras started to suck.
Well, it all started to suck, and then
He
he
came
came
back.
back.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, nobody watches tennis.
I know. I think it's yeah, you're right. Nobody watches tennis, for sure. Peyton Manning, I mean, that was sad to watch.
That was
He
got a Super Bowl.
Yeah, but the first
Did
half
he?
of that
Or
season.
did Wade Phillips win a Super Bowl? I think Wade Phillips and Bob Miller won a Super Bowl.
Yeah. He ran for a first down at one point.
Oh, he did. But that's because you're a Broncos fan, right? Like, that's like, oh, Peyton.
Right.
That Peyton Manning and the 28-year-old Peyton Manning are just, just significantly different.
John Elway for sure. Like he
Elway.
almost redeemed himself after the 3 losses, right?
Yeah. He ended on top for sure. I'm trying to think of other folks, right? What sports myths come to mind for all of you? What myths in your life have played a part that you remember? Evelyn, you're a Broncos fan.
Kurt Warner, 2001 was a pretty good one.
Kurt Warner,
The
huh?
bag boy.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, his rise from bag boy to arena football to
Yeah.
CFL to NFL to win a Super Bowl in his first year.
So let's take the Kurt Warner myth then, okay? For the story of Kurt Warner, you got a guy from Iowa, played high school football there, went to UNI, had a lot of success at UNI, right? Never got drafted, or never, yeah. Did you get drafted? Ends up, working at a grocery store, playing arena football. He makes the Rams team. The Rams starting quarterback gets hurt in training camp. Trent Green, right? He's supposed to be one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Kurt Warner steps in, wins the Super Bowl, right? That retelling. Okay, that's the basic story. What values, ethics, morals can we begin to draw from that story? Like what?
Like work hard at something.
Right?
And you'll,
Effort.
you'll get yours.
Working hard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? He's a religious person, so that will get retold by certain groups, right? They'll pull that out and talk about the religiosity. He's a humanitarian, he takes care of kids and all of this stuff. He adopted, he's a stepdad, right? Like that he gives all of these different tools, depending on how that story is retold, how that ritual plays out, how it is legitimized, that works for people, that gives value to people. That's a good one.
So would Drew Brees not fall in that?
Where would you throw Drew Brees in that?
I mean, him coming back from his surgery, the surgeries or whatever, and talking about how you've never be able to do it again, I guess, pretty much.
Yeah. I'm not close enough to that one. To me, the Drew Brees one is always his height, right? He's the short guy who ends up having a cannon.
Well, and how he ended up in New Orleans.
New Orleans.
From San Diego.
Yeah. I mean, he has kind of the phoenix, right? The rising from the ashes type thing. For sure.
I'm a big K-State football fan because my dad went to K-State,
Okay.
and they were the worst team ever for their whole existence of their football program. But then Bill Snyder came in and totally changed that. So he's so revered. This, he still coaches there, and their stadium is named after him already.
That's funny that you bring up Bill Snyder because the story, the myth, right, for Iowa football fans is that Hayden Fry created all of these coaches, right, who've had all this success. Bill Snyder being one, Bill Ferentz, Bob Stoops, right, all of these coaches, Brett Bielema, people who coach under Fry. And so that's the myth that we tell, right? It's just how, again, this is a human being who we place up on a pedestal and tell stories of that are more mystical, right? Mythical than the reality of it all. Okay.
It'd be like you, like being a professor here and like doing so good, and then now we call it like this.
The tree, Sam Jay's tree of wisdom. Spread them out, right? Yeah.
Samuel Jay's.
It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen. We're gonna build media empires. We're going viral. Yeah, let's see, we have one person watching now. Tell your friends, get on there. Come on now. You weren't here the other day. We're live streaming this shit. Yeah. See what sticks. What else? Okay, I mean, either one of you. I know you're a big sports fan. Do you have that myth that plays a part in your life, or that you can go back to and think about?
I can't think of
Really?
anything right now.
Really? No New York Rangers myths. Mark Messier.
I mean,
Messier.
yeah.
But Messier is a good one too.
I don't know. I've been like thinking for like 15 minutes, and I just can't.
Can't think of any.
I can't
Tony
get it.
Hawk's 900.
What's that?
Oh, shit.
Tony Hawk when he did the 900.
914 chimes.
But it was like there was this huge conspiracy because Toss Papas like was trying to do it first, but he was kind of like a bad boy skateboarding, like drank, like had tattoos
Yeah.
and everything. But Tony Hawk was like the golden boy who could like be marketed because he like was clean and had a good backstory.
Yeah.
So they like made him do it first,
Okay.
and like they didn't let Papas get into the
Interesting.
games. Yeah.
Wow.
There's a documentary about it.
Okay. What's the documentary called?
Like Papas Brothers. I don't know this.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just listening to like how YouTube changed skateboarding, because you used to like pop these tricks that nobody had seen before, but now
Right.
they're
Or like how
skateboarding
to
the
slow
new way.
it down.
Yeah.
Right.
It's crazy. Technology. So you can't think of one. Do you have one?
I mean, like I was like really little, but like I remember when the Rockies went to the World Series, and like all I remember from that World Series, honestly, is just Matt Holliday, Matt Holliday, Matt Holliday,
Yeah.
Matt Holliday.
Yeah.
Like that's
That's
all
good.
I remember from
For
the
sure.
World Series.
Well, I mean, think about all those heroes that Coors continues to celebrate, right? So you remember a few years ago where they had the T-shirts for the 25th anniversary? You go like, I don't know, it was 5 or 6 games that year. They gave out T-shirts, and they were like the most iconic images of Rocky's history.
They're doing that again, I think, this week.
Are they really? Okay. Yeah, I mean,
It's funny that we celebrate something that like, well, I mean, we have
Yeah.
had it right, but we don't have like that.
that's what you stick to, right? I mean,
It's
that's
just like funny to think that like I don't know. So we don't have a World Series where we like just cling on to this like.
And also that year was like, what they do, like 27 or 28 to get to the
It was
Series,
crazy.
something
Yeah,
like
it was a
that.
great
So
And we had to win a wild card.
yeah.
It's funny that, like, I was just thinking of this as a fan of a losing team. Like, the Cubs lost for my entire life. But there isn't a myth.
Yeah, like how are you a fan?
There isn't, but there's not like a story that you tell about, that great moment.
The Cleveland Browns. Like how are you?
Yeah, I know.
How are you a fan of that?
It was just on TV. That's the only reason. Well, it's just on TV. Right? Cable.
No one's-
You watch the Braves or the Cubs. I didn't like the Braves, so I watched the Cubs. Larry, what's yours? You got a myth?
I would probably say Vince Lombardi.
Really? Okay.
Winning is everything.
Uh-huh.
And what he did, in the '60s, he was a hero. He was a god. He could have run for governor, but just the fact of his philosophy of football, and he became somebody that would speak to business groups based on his philosophy of football.
I think there is, that person still probably resonates as a very mythical figure after the fact. Yeah, for sure. Was Vince Lombardi a good person? You never hear.
Yeah, he was, people in Wisconsin were angry when he left to go to Washington.
Okay.
But, no, he was a good person. He was, there was, now who knows, but back then there wasn't the press that you get now. But yeah, he was looked at as just a real leader, great mind.
Yeah.
And a caring person.
Yeah.
He cared about his players.
Interesting. You brought up a good point. I want to know, it would be interesting how some of those figures, those heroes, would function in a world where everybody knows everything about them, or the other way around, right? Like, yeah, it'd be interesting.
I mean, no different than John F. Kennedy. I mean,
Yeah.
You know,
For sure.
What about like Todd Helton? I think he goes a little under the radar a bit, even though he did just as much time here as Elway did.
Mhm.
He did like 1 year under. I saw him more of a hero as well.
Yeah.
Especially because he didn't have a bad reputation, from what I remember. I could be
He could
wrong.
have gone anywhere he wanted to,
Yeah.
to try to win World Series, and he just decided to stick it out with Colorado.
Yeah. So I just thought that he's more of that unsung hero to the team or to the city itself.
Did he win though? You know. Well, I guess he got to the World
They
Series
got
That's
to
a World
the
Series.
at the end of his
They got
career.
to-
We
Yeah,
still
that
like
was-
that
one
was
was beating the Red Sox.
That was horrible. Just kept on home. They just won one game. Just one game in the series. They just got ugly.
All right, that'll do it for today, everybody. So let's get you out of here, okay? And
Didn't I tell you that's how my cousin named their newborn son? They were watching Bartman.